Here. I'm just wondering, when you reduce everything down to the rate maker view or the rate payer view at the end of the day, and if you pick Michigan as an example, and I'm sure there's going to be a wide variability, but if you could just kind of share some of the views of what the rate impact would be, even if the Clean Power Plan is not going to be implemented, just looking at the IRPs and the regular planning processes of, are we at a tipping point because natural gas is so cheap that it no longer pays to extend life of a coal plant in some of these older facilities or to do the upgrades that might be necessary as a result? If you can just kind of talk through some of that, maybe what a ratepayer might be thinking about if they're paying $100 a month now in electric bills, with some of this stuff, what's the range of impact to the ratepayers in the future?
Once again, to quote Yogi Berra, predictions are hard, particularly about the future. It is, I think you can look at it a few different ways that are at least useful, which is the net effect of the rule will be to equalize the utility rates across the nation so that the middle of the country, including the Rocky Mountain West and the Midwest, their rates were going to tend to rise to an equilibrium with those on the coasts, because those coasts, except Washington and Oregon, because they have a nice little resource called the Columbia River that does wonders for their rates. Those coasts have adopted energy policies that already reflect a lot of the Clean Power Plan assumptions. As to what it means for rates in a specific state, it's going to depend on where you are now and where you need to be. Remarkably, the EPA rule at least assumes no net additions of gas capacity in the country. That's just the assumption in the rule. It's not to say it's banned, because there is the flexibility that Laura talked about. But the EPA assumes that most of that carbon bogey is going to be made up for renewable additions. The intermittency and the capacity factor of those resources is difficult, to put it mildly, but it still is all going to pivot off that gas price. If you look at the restructured markets in the Midwest, ERCOT in Texas and so forth, the gas price is what sets the wholesale electricity price. That's the clearing price that you're going to get almost inevitably. And if you have a future of perpetual cheap gas, then there will be rate increases, but they will not be as hard as if you have a future of much higher future gas prices. And if I knew where the gas price was going to be at 2025, 2030, I wouldn't be here. I'd be a billionaire gas trader right now. So what you're doing, in essence, is tying most of your rate predictability onto what that gas price looks like and what happens in the world market for gas once enough of that gets off on LNG terminals. I think the first LNG terminal's opening this week down in Texas. The world equilibrium price for natural gas is much higher than the price here in the US, but is anybody's guess. But that gas price is what a lot of the rate effect is going to pivot off of.
And I think it's important to mention energy efficiency and the enormous opportunities that exist there. In EPA's in their regulatory impact analysis, they looked at the effect of energy efficiency. And even though they projected that rates may initially go up across the country, that energy efficiency would actually bring down the cost of consumers' bills by 8% by 2030. So I just wanted to point that out, and thank you for your point of view on the natural gas piece.
Since 2004, the Wyoming Infrastructure Authority has been focused on building transmission. And one of the things that we've learned by experience is the time to permit transmission lines and the time to site wind and all those things is much longer than we would have hoped. And so when you take a look at taking 30% of the nation's coal fleet, or whatever that number is, off the grid and filling with renewables, how in the world are we going to be able to permit transmission and site all that stuff in time to meet the demands? Is there any plans? We've had special initiatives through the government to expedite transmission and rapid response teams and all that, but we don't seem to be able to move the ball on transmission. And so I guess, not really related to the Clean Power Plan, but it seems like if everybody's going to be moving to the same source of generation at the same time in big numbers, and the ability to deliver that power is constrained because of permitting and environmental stuff, it seems like a problem that we're going to be facing in the pretty near future.
I think you're 100% right. It's kind of one of the Blackboard economics assumptions that EPA makes in the rule, which is imagine a ubiquitous, non-congested transmission system around the country where I can move an electron from Maine to California without trouble. It's far from that, and given the nature of the different interconnects, it's even harder. I am a abiding transmission construction pessimist. I have seen more drawing board transmission lines across and in the West in my career than I would care to share. In 2003, I wrote an editorial for Energy Daily calling for federal backstop siting authority for transmission lines like we have for natural gas pipelines. And other than provoking a lot of hate mail from my former state commissioners that I used to sit with, it went nowhere, and it continually gets raised and tends to go nowhere. Transmission is immensely hard, particularly for those of us here in the West where federal lands are involved. They've had some incremental progress on some of that stuff, but it is a briar patch that is just can lead to despair. And I don't see how, short of kind of revolutionary federal transformation of how you do this, that you're going to get any real movement on the time it takes to build a transmission line. All the power to people who are trying, and you're doing great work, and I hope someone can lure me out of my congenital pessimism, but it's a really, really, really hard thing, and the federal government makes it harder. And then the NIMBY blocking position that exists state by state, county by county, it makes it a formidable challenge.
We certainly received a lot of comments on the proposed rule on just this very issue and the time that it would take. And I know the administration has taken up the NEPA process and looking at how that process could be streamlined. I don't know where all that stands, but certainly we're very sympathetic to that, which is one of the reasons why we moved the initial compliance period out to 2022 and the final out to 2030 to give folks more time to make those plans and get those transmission lines in place.
Could I ask Laura just a prediction from you, if you feel comfortable? How far out on the timelines do you think that the stay? Let's assume that the rule is ultimately reinstituted. How far do you think those timelines are going to slip, if you feel comfortable?
If I had to guess, I'd say a couple years.
I just have maybe a quick question. I don't know, have there been any estimates on the amount of investment that would be required to implement, decommissioning, retirement of coal power plants, and building of other energy resources to achieve the plan? Have you seen any estimates along those lines?
I haven't, but I've heard that there's a group in Colorado who's looking at what it would actually mean to shut down every coal-fired power plant in the state. And they've run some numbers on that. I could try and get you something on that, but I've just heard about it, so I haven't really had a chance to look at it. But I think there's something like that out there.
Yeah, and it's hard because some of it depends on what sorts of state plans emerge. I think it's probably non-controversial to say, or it should be, that the most expensive way to go about compliance is to do it as a standalone state and just take your within your four borders and make those decisions. Now, there's a perverse incentive to do that as well for energy exporting states, which is take the plants that are exporting energy and say, we'll shut those down. Godspeed, Utah, Nebraska, wherever you're exporting the power. Now, they're going to go nuts, needless to say. But if it ends up where I think most people think it will, and from a lower cost planning perspective, you will get mass-based trading of carbon allocations, because that means you'll have a more liquid market, a broader trading platform to do it. Huge questions in the West is, where's the platform come from, who runs it, and how's it work? Because it's not a trivial expense and it's not a trivial institution building exercise. But the cost is going to depend a lot on the different equilibria that you can imagine on what the states collectively do. And part of that gets to what I alluded to as well, is there's a huge political economy fight that is yet to break out between electric generation unit owners, between different constituencies in different states. Because if I am a coal-centric utility without a lot of scale, what I'm looking at is a catastrophic transformation if I don't get a free surplus of allocations through either the state or the regional process. So those decisions, which are going to be state decisions, are going to have enormous import and going to move enormous amounts of money as to who wins and who loses. And we haven't even begun to see how those fights look. But I can assure you they're going to be desperate and they're going to be enormous.
But what you didn't say specifically is what the effects might be, the trickle-down effects on the communities in which these coal-fired units or these coal mines exist. And that's something that I'm really sensitive to. And we've been looking at that with the help of our environmental justice folks at EPA. And I think, it's something that we all need to really, have a conversation about. The president had a program called the Power Plan to help fund communities who are in transition, in particular coal communities who are in transition, either their coal-fired power plants or their coal mines were shutting down. It was reappropriated in the FY16 budget. I'm yet to find out exactly what numbers there are. It's millions of dollars, and I understand this summer communities and tribes will be able to start applying for that money. So I've been trying to dig into the appropriations bill and the amendments to try and find out exactly what that funding is, but that money is going to start becoming available for communities should anyone be a community advocate that might be interested in that.
I think the impact is far more than communities. Would you take a look at rural America as a community, which is roughly 75% of the nation's landmass? Rural America will bleed from this impact of coal because of all the interrelatedness from the jobs that are created, whether you're mining coal, whether you're working at a coal-fired power plant. It seems like the economic analysis of basically taking rural America and cutting out, the biggest part of what makes it strong is the energy industries, whether it's the working at the coal plants, working in the mining industry, and the domino effect of that. I think, well, at least from my perspective, being part of rural America, I think it's something that's been well understated and not really looked at. And I think people should be really scared about that. And, from Wyoming's perspective, Wyoming's the tip of the spear. We did a study a couple years ago that talked about the job loss in Wyoming, and I think for Northeast Wyoming, they said it was 1 in 10 jobs. I think that might be light. Wyoming as a state is very small, only 500,000 people, so maybe the two coasts don't care, but Wyoming is not the only state that's going to feel this, and I think I just don't see how, just like you, I'm get out the Kleenex, step on the soapbox and pull out the Kleenex, but I just think we haven't really paid attention to the impacts on the people yet, and it's much bigger than community A or community B. I think it's entire rural America.
Well, if you look at the types of utilities that are most acutely challenged, it's coal-centric utilities, and the G&Ts in particular, Tri-State and Basin, are both vocal opponents of the rule, and I know have challenges that another utility with a more balanced portfolio might not have. I joked, and it was definitely with gallows humor, when I got to talk to the Wyoming Rural Electric Association this fall with Chairman Muneer from the PSC. I said, I think you have two choices, which is you could secede and try and join Canada, or start asking for a bailout now. But neither one of them are very realistic or dignified choices. But it presents a real big challenge to a coal-centric utility that doesn't have a lot of scale and doesn't have the demographics and income profile of, say, Boulder, Colorado, who is gung-ho for more renewables and less coal, and doesn't care if their utility bills go up 20, 30, 40%.
I'm Gene Freeman from the University of Colorado. We've talked about 3 of the 4 silos in this problem. The EPA is focused on the supply side of energy. There's a finance part of this thing. There's the transmission part of this. There's very little discussion in any of the forums that I've been to talk about the demand side, which ultimately propels all of the emissions. Are there EPA credits in this scheme for utilities or states that do something tangible to reduce the load and the profile of the load?
There are indeed, and I talked about the emission rate credits and the allowances that can be generated through energy efficiency projects. Also, the Clean Energy Incentive Program incentivizes early action on energy efficiency programs, specifically in low-income communities, and would match those at double the rate of wind and solar projects. So yes, EPA has put a lot of thought into the energy efficiency piece of this and the power that it could hold for states in terms of complying with their state goals.
Yeah, and one of the things Laura touched on is the state measures approach to compliance. We did our last white paper was in part touched on the state measures path. And one of the things that I think states, if they have to get serious and try and comply, if this is the upheld law, is they probably will increase manifold their DSM under either a state measures approach or some other way to, in essence, create currency, if you will, to trade. And it gets complex and kind of epicycle upon epicycle as to how you do that under a state measures path. To say that there is some low-hanging fruit on the demand side may be true. My experience with demand-side programs is they vastly underestimate what we call the Jevons paradox. There are some fairly rigorous studies, particularly the Michigan housing study, that show there's not as much bang for the buck in DSM programs as the advocates might assume. I can't say I've gone deep enough to believe yes or no how much is out there on the demand side. We can certainly do a much better job than we do in the U.S. utility structure in communicating price signals to consumers, to communicating price signals to more than just large industrial customers. So I'm not saying there's nothing there, and I certainly know that the rate structures we currently have in the country do nothing to encourage demand-side reductions, or do very little, rather be the more accurate. So there may be something there, but I also get skeptical when it's portrayed as the painless path to compliance.
We've been talking with the National Renewable Energy and their Buildings and Thermal Systems Unit about the tools that they have available, that they have developed, that are being rolled out, and on the back end being supported by them. But they've become so sophisticated that a utility could take these tools and look at every consumer within their territory, down to the type of housing that they have, how much they're currently using, and what the opportunities are, and then plug in the opportunities, plug in the costs, and run these models that are fairly sophisticated. And so I'd be happy to put any of you who might want to explore this a little bit further in touch with these NREL folks, because I think the tools that they have are pretty powerful.
Any more questions? Well, all right.
Question for
Yep.
Laura, if she would indulge me. Specifically as to state measures, I have heard two different things from EPA, and maybe you can reconcile them. And I know that there are different camps on this, and so maybe your answer is yes, no, maybe. As it relates to state measures, if you as a state decide to go that path, which is to pass or to create a series of state measures that both create more carbon allocations and so forth, is the federal enforceability a backstop, or is it still primary? And I know that PG&E, for instance, has written a very good white paper that says it's a backstop, but I've also heard the EPA being somewhat equivocal, saying, no, we're still first on the enforceability front.
Under a state measures plan, the state would have to come in with a federally enforceable backstop. So under a mass-based plan, that could mean just meeting their mass-based goal in the end, if they weren't meeting their mass-based goal with their state measures.
It's probably a longer conversation offline.
Maybe.
I just want to know.
One last time, any other questions from the audience? Well, with that,
Nope.
Oh, Al, you're hiding behind the camera here.
I have to say I have a completely different view about energy efficiency in Wyoming. I'm Al Manier, the chairman of the Public Service Commission. Sitting in front of you is Mike Easley with Precorp. Mike Easley has just filed a rate application to increase their rates, largely because the consumption that's related to the local industry is decreasing. I think energy efficiency is a terrific solution if you're in an economy that's growing. If you're in an economy that's contracting, the same number of people, even if they're using less energy, still have to pay for essentially the same size of electric network. So the notion that you're going to pass me a program and I can run around from house to house in the state of Wyoming and tell them all to conserve anything is not going to do us any good if, as a result of the Clean Power Program, our economy is contracting. So I just want to let you know, let everybody else know that there are different views about this. And while I have another actual question on something else other than energy efficiency. It's reliability. If you look at the proposed federal rules, what becomes apparent is that the supposed flexibility of the state to create goals disappears. You really wind up having to essentially pass on the category-specific goals if you're going to actually have a trading-ready program, which is the whole point, at least if I understand the preamble correctly, of why this program is structured the way it is. if you're, not me, but you're Todd Parfit, who'll be running this program, what happens to reliability is that the state is supposed to be considering reliability, but in reality, all the state can do is pass on to the EGUs specific goals and targets, all right? Now, the EPA makes it quite clear that that's what we do, but they also make it quite clear that the entire program is designed around the flexibility of the EGUs to increase production if they want to even, because the trading regime allows the decision about how many ERCs or credits are to be produced to be left to the generator. For someone that's trying to plan for reliability, I haven't run across anybody yet that has a solution about how it is you plan for reliability when there's that much uncertainty about what the production will be. Can either of you help me out with that?
Do you want to start with that?
I think you're exactly right, Chairman Meneer. You've got to some extent, forecast what that ERC or allocation market is going to look like, what the clearing price might or might not be. And if you have a reliability must-run situation, I suppose just suck it up and start buying allocation credits from Washington State or something like that. But the fundamental reliability puzzle here, particularly given the assumption that you're trading out coal for not gas, but coal for renewables, becomes quite severe. On the demand response side, your point is very well taken, given that the costs of a utility system remain largely fixed no matter how much use is going on or how much demand response exists. You get into this very strange paradoxical situation where utility commissions and utilities are driven to a rate design that is very much what we would call straight fixed variable, where you throw the fixed cost onto a fixed monthly charge to make sure that the utility can recover those costs. Now, the strange thing there is your increment of demand response responsibility shrinks. So in other words, let me put it in English for those of you who don't speak utility. Right now, I may have a $20 a month fixed charge and an $80 a month variable charge. And I can think as a customer, hey, if I cut my use, I can cut down that 80% variable charge. The paradox of a declining rate with potent DSM is you change the rate design to recover the fixed cost through a fixed charge. So all of a sudden it goes from 20/80 to 60/40. And if I only have a 40% variable charge, well, maybe I don't turn my air conditioner down because I just want to be comfortable and I'm not going to save that much. So, you get these cross currents even on an individual basis that cut different ways here. But it's certainly the trend right now, driven in some states largely by solar and rooftop solar, that utilities are moving toward increasing their fixed charges. And I think part of that is, one, it's more efficient rate design for the econ geeks here, but two, it is more demand insensitive, which it has to be if you've got a fixed cost.
Well, on energy efficiency, Al, I recall reading your comments on the proposed rule, and thank you. They were very well thought out and very useful, actually. And we do recognize that in rural areas, like the state of Wyoming, implementing energy efficiency programs is far more challenging. And I would point you all to Al's comments that he submitted to the EPA on the proposed rule, because they really lay out the complexities of that and how difficult it really is to achieve results under energy efficiency programs in a state like this. Regarding reliability, and we don't deny that implementing the Clean Power Plan is going to be very complex. There's going to be a lot of certainty. I mean, for example, how are the prices for ERCs and allowances going to be set, and what are those initial prices going to be? EPA is not going to be setting those. It's going to be on a state-by-state basis, or maybe on a utility-by-utility basis. So a lot of uncertainty regarding the reliability. I do want to point out again that there are some mechanisms built into the Clean Power Plan to help with reliability. If a state feels like they're having reliability issues, they can come to EPA and ask for a state plan revision. And then there are the safety valves that can be implemented in emergency situations. But we do have, in the West, we have WEC, who has agreed to help the states with reliability modeling moving forward once they receive all the different plans. So we think that's going to be helpful. And then we have, again, like I mentioned before, EPA working with DOE and FERC to look at reliability issues moving forward. So hopefully it won't be the problem that it is perhaps anticipated to be by some folks.
The question I would ask is, as you say, the direction is to go to more and more renewable energy, which is intermittent. And that means, let's take the extreme case that probably doesn't exist but makes the point, is you wind up with peak power and no renewable energy available. Then how do you pay for the backup or the storage, and how long do you say that outage can be? It's one thing if it's 1 hour, it's another if it's a week. So what are the plans to take into account the fact, if you're moving in this direction, you're going to wind up with some period of time when you wind up with a peak load that right now can only be covered with fossil fuel?
Well, we do anticipate by 2030 that coal will still be 30% of the mix of energy production in the country. So I'm not a utility planner. I'm sorry, I can't really tell you, what the utilities are thinking around that. I can't tell you exactly what folks like the National Renewable Energy are looking at in terms of future technologies, including storage, and how those might be able to help with those kinds of instances that you mentioned. So I do apologize for that, but we did extend the compliance period, the final compliance period, out to 2030, thinking that that is a long enough time to tackle some of these really challenging problems that have been brought up, and so we'll see how that all plays out.
Well, Laura just pointed out that she's not a utility planner, and I'd say that's exactly the problem, that EPA has presumed to become the utility planner and really doesn't know how the electric system works. Wind is a perfectly fine marginal resource. I ordered the first rate-based wind farm in Colorado in the early 2000s. The challenge with wind is its intermittency, and the story actually gets worse. And you see this story playing out in both ERCOT and the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, which is EPA assumes a capacity factor of 40% for wind and then runs that through the model as to how you change out your capacity and what is potential renewables. The problem, of course, is the intermittency of wind is actually somewhat predictable, and this is what you see working out in ERCOT. When wind is at its highest production is during the shoulder months, spring and summer, and at night. For those of you who have even the slightest sense of utility planning, when do you not need power? The answer is during the shoulder months at night. And so what's happening within MISO and ERCOT, which are both restructured wholesale markets, is all of that wind is running at near capacity, and it is driving the market price in those areas to zero. And in fact, if the market price could go negative, which is to say you'd have to pay to put power on the grid, it would. It hits a zero bound, And you've got hours within MISO and ERCOT because of the quantity of wind within those markets where the price is zero. Now, if in those markets you are the owner of a nuclear plant or a coal plant, what is happening to you when that market price is zero? You're running the plant and you're making no money. So what we've seen in both Texas and in MISO is that the fossil units, and particularly the nuclear units, are exiting the market. The coal plants in Texas that have exited, they're just being mothballed, presuming that a market mechanism will emerge to correct that, namely a capacity market. The nuclear guys, incidentally, are running around the country with their hair on fire, saying, we are the low carbon baseload solution you've been looking for, but you have market rules that are driving us from the market. Pilgrim is the one that is shutting down in the Northeast. Exelon, which owns the nuclear units in Illinois, has said, we're going to make a decision to shut those down within the next 2 years if you don't come up with a solution. So ironically, what you have is an EPA cross-current saying reduce carbon output. You then have a market design problem in certainly Texas and the Midwest that is saying nuclear units leave, and they are. And that's going to leave a potential huge capacity hole in the Midwest because Exelon, I think it's a few thousand megawatts of nuclear capacity that it has said just in the last month, we're shutting it down if you don't solve the problem.
Well, with that, I would like to thank both of my speakers. We're on schedule. It is time for lunch. But this is great discussion. Clearly, there's a lot of issues that are that need to be worked through as Clean Power Plan moves forward. I would just like to thank both of my speakers for taking the time and coming to visit us with us today. Please stay for lunch. Looks like lunch is ready in the back, or just about ready. So it is kind of a networking time, so please continue these conversations. And our last speaker of the day will be at 1 o'clock.